This short lecture talks about assessing the quality of research measures. Just to refresh your memory, what is a research measure? A measure is basically a tool for measuring something. So a thermometer is used to measure temperature. It's a measure of temperature. A scale is a measure of weight. And a list of questions very frequently is a measure of some concept that we are interested in when we study communication. So when we talk about research measures in the context of this unit, most frequently it will refer to lists of questions that we write in order to collect information using either surveys or experiments methodologies. So let's take a concrete example so that you have a better understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about the quality of research measures. Audra is doing a study on the effects of watching soap operas on self-esteem among stay-at-home moms in the United States. And she designed a list of items that will be the measure of self-esteem. And here is our measure. It consists of 4 items. Opening up with an introductory question. How often do you think that you're a good person, feel proud of yourself, like yourself, think highly of yourself? Do you think that Audra's measure will give her the information she wants? In other words, is this a good measure of self-esteem? There are 2 ways in which we determine the quality or goodness of a measure that we created. And these 2 criteria are called validity and reliability. Validity is the extent to which the measure is accurate. In other words, it's the extent to which a measure measures what it's supposed to measure. And I know that it sounds a little funny, but that is the point. So a measure is valid when it captures the variable or concept that it is intended to capture. A very simple example of a measure that is not valid in a particular context would be if I tried to check my temperature by using a measuring tape. Is it possible using a measuring tape to tell what your body temperature is? No, because a measuring tape is not a valid measure of your body temperature. More specifically, validity is also the problem of accuracy. Is your measure accurately capturing the entire concept that you're measuring or not? Think about it in terms of playing darts. When you're trying to hit the bullseye, is your measure hitting the bullseye every time you are using it to measure something, or is it always kind of off the mark? Another aspect of quality of research measures is reliability. Think about what that word means. When somebody is reliable, we can rely on them. They kind of behave in a predictable way, right? We know that this person is going to act in a certain way in certain situations, and we can rely on that. That's exactly what it means. Reliability is the extent to which a measure is consistent and dependable. So I have a bathroom scale in my house, and unfortunately I bought it really cheaply because I didn't want to spend money on a fancy electronic one. And now every time I step on the bathroom scale, and I mean something like several times over the period of 1 minute, it tells me a different weight. So once I step on it and I find out that I'm 115 pounds. Another time I step on it and I learned that I'm 135 pounds. Then I step on it again and I'm 120 pounds. So what is my weight? It is impossible for a human being to lose and gain weight so quickly over a period of seconds, right? The problem is the measure, the scale. It's unreliable. It's not finely tuned enough, if you will. And so it doesn't give you consistent results where it should give you consistent results. So these are the two concepts that we use to determine if a measure is of good quality and consequently it will give us good information. Validity and reliability. Let's talk about the different ways of checking validity of a measure. There's quite a few ways to determine the validity of a measure. The basic kind of approach is called content validity. Content validity is simply the extent to which a measure appears to be capturing the concept accurately. So, in other words, on the face of it, does it appear valid? Does it appear to be capturing all of the concept that you're trying to capture or measure? And so, the basic kind of content validity is face validity. Face validity assessment basically just means taking a look at the measure that you just developed and thinking about it for a moment to see, does it look like it's valid? Does it look on the face of it like it's capturing everything about the concept I'm trying to measure that it's supposed to capture? So I'm going to take you back to that example of Audra's measure of self-esteem. Take a look at the items here. Does it capture all of the aspects of human self-esteem? Does it have enough questions or items that it's going to give you a really good picture of what a person's self-esteem is? By looking at it, I would tell you, well, for one thing, there's many different dimensions to the concept of self-esteem, and we may have high level of self-esteem on one dimension, but low level of self-esteem on another, and this doesn't really seem to reflect different dimensions. It's kind of very vague. And so, for example, maybe I think that I'm a good person, but then think about the area of appearance, physical appearance. It's a very important aspect of self-esteem. Notice how many times people will go shopping for clothes, or they will go to a hair salon to have their hair done, or get a total makeover, go to the fitness club to get fit, just so that they can feel better about themselves. So self-esteem, one big dimension of it is physical appearance and fitness. But this measure doesn't capture it. There isn't a single item in it that asks about how a person feels about their physical appearance. So right away, just by looking at it, at the face of it, this measure to me does not appear to be valid. Or in other words, it doesn't have high face validity. I would suggest to the person developing this measure, Audra, to think about this some more and consider what are the different dimensions of self-esteem, and then write items that are going to capture those different dimensions accurately. Another type of content validity, very similar to face validity, is called expert panel validity. It also involves just looking at a measure that a person developed, but the person looking is supposed to be an expert in some field. So if I was Audra, I could go to a psychologist or some researcher in the field of human psychology and ask this person, based on what you know about self-esteem, does this measure that I develop appear to be valid? Does it cover self-esteem correctly? And so you ask an expert to give you an opinion on the validity of this measure. So both face validity and expert panel validity just simply involve kind of eyeballing what you have developed and then deciding whether or not this is a valid, appropriate measure of self-esteem or any other concepts you're measuring. And then we go into more sophisticated ways of determining validity. These include predictive validity and construct validity. And then construct validity has two subtypes, convergent and discriminant. To illustrate them for you a little bit better, I included in this unit an example of an article written about emotional intelligence. The authors developed a measure of emotional intelligence, and they were conducting tests in this study to determine if that was a valid measure of emotional intelligence. And so what they did is they tested different kinds of validity. So those other types, other than content validity, require you to actually go out and administer the measure to a sample of people and look at the results of what the responses were on that measure. So they require you to actually do a study, whereas content validity, the most basic way of assessing how accurate a measure is, doesn't. You can just eyeball what you wrote and see if it seems okay. And that's the most basic way that people usually use to determine if their measure is valid. However, sometimes that's not good enough, and that's why researchers actually conduct studies so that they have hard data to demonstrate that their measure is valid. So let's begin with predictive validity. Predictive validity is the extent to which the scores on a measure, or the results that we obtained from using this measure, are predictive of some future outcome or future behavior. So, for example, driving tests. People take driving tests because it is assumed that a driving test will predict how well you will be able to handle a car on the road. The assumption is that if you pass a driving test, then you can safely go out on the road and drive. Now, is a driving test really predictively valid? Does it predict how safely you drive? I'm sure you will agree with me that it's probably not that predictively valid. Still, of course, it's being used very widely to give people driver's licenses because we haven't come up with anything better. Let's look at this example from the article itself. So they looked at a measure of emotional intelligence, and they also wanted to see whether it will predict, as it should, some future outcome. So let's read, this is on page 174 of the article. According to Goldman, 1995, emotional intelligence plays an important role in determining how successful people are after they enter a setting. To examine whether our scale could predict success in a setting, we conducted a longitudinal study to test whether scores on the emotional intelligence measure would predict college students' success in their first year. Because theoretically, emotional intelligence should improve your ability to succeed in new places, then it should predict your level of emotional intelligence, whether or not you are going to be successful in your first year in college. And so to test this predictive validity, they had 33 female and 31 male first-year college students complete the responses to the emotional intelligence scale. And they did so during their first month at the university in southeastern United States. And at the end of the academic year, the researchers obtained the students' official cumulative GPA. Let's see if emotional intelligence was indeed predictively valid in this case. Scores on the 33-item self-report measure of emotional intelligence completed at the start of the academic year significantly predicted grade point average at the end of the year, which means, yes, emotional intelligence does predict your GPA such that the higher your emotional intelligence level, the higher your GPA after your first year in college. So it appears to have predictive validity in this case. Now, testing just one relationship like this isn't good enough for most researchers to say that definitely a measure they developed is valid or not. And that's why in most studies that involve validation or determination whether or not a measure is valid, there is more types of validity that are tested. So let's go back to the slides, and I'm going to show you what the other two kinds are. The other two kinds are types of construct validity. So let me explain construct validity, and bear with me, it may seem a little vague in the beginning, but it really isn't. We all know that certain things are correlated, right? So for example, if you are satisfied with your romantic relationship, you are also likely to stay in the romantic relationship. So in other words, the relational satisfaction is related with the length of a relationship. Or the approval ratings that a president has during his term in office usually are correlated to people's willingness to vote for that president again, right? So these two constructs are correlated with each other. Emotional intelligence, in our example, also is expected to be correlated with other specific constructs, which I'm going to give you examples of in a moment. So a measure has high construct validity if scores on that measure are correlated with scores on measures of other constructs, which theoretically should be related to your measure whose construct you're validating. And if you're getting lost, stop this recording, rewind, and listen again. And so there's also a bunch of constructs that your measure shouldn't be correlated with because it represents a different type of construct, and that is called discriminant validity. So construct validity, convergent and discriminant, is based on theoretical relationships among different concepts. And if you're measuring what you're supposed to be measuring using that new measure you developed, then it should be behaving as the theory would predict. This may become more transparent if we look at an example, starting with convergent validity. This is on page 171 of the article. So convergent validity is based on the idea that some constructs are expected to be theoretically correlated. One would expect a valid measure of emotional intelligence to be related to measures that assess specific aspects of awareness and expression of emotion, outlook on life, depressed mood, ability to regulate emotions, and impulsivity. As expected, they find higher scores on the emotional intelligence scale were associated with less alexithymia, greater attention to feelings, greater clarity of feeling, more mood repair, greater optimism, less pessimism, less depression, and less impulsivity. So, in other words, emotional intelligence, using the measure that the authors were testing, was behaving as it should be behaving in relation to those other constructs or concepts like depression, pessimism, impulsivity, optimism, as it should be relating to them. So if you have high level of emotional intelligence, you have also high level of optimism. If you have high level of emotional intelligence, you have less depression, you have less impulsivity. This is what the theory would predict because it makes sense. People who are more sensitive to others' feelings also tend to be less impulsive and less depressed. And this is what the data showed. In other words, the measure behaved the way it should have behaved given what we theoretically know about emotional intelligence. And so we can say that because of all of these different relationships working out in the data the way we predicted them to work out, we can say that this measure has pretty good convergent validity. Convergent validity is the extent to which your measure correlates to other measures that it theoretically should correlate with. And there's actually much more data that again confirms once again that the measure behaves the way it should be behaving. One would expect certain between group differences on a valid measure of emotional intelligence. We expected that a group of psychotherapists who were part of our sample would score higher on the measure than a group of female prisoners and higher than a group of individuals in a substance abuse program. You could expect probably, right, that people who are psychotherapists would have higher emotional intelligence than prisoners. And indeed, look, therapists score significantly higher than the prisoners and than clients in a substance abuse program on emotional intelligence. So once again, the measure is behaving in relation to other constructs the way it should be behaving, and so we are saying that it has strong validity. And finally, we have discriminant validity. This is the extent to which the measure is not related to certain constructs, that it should not be related to given the theory. So let's look at the study example once again. And now we're going to page 174. So here, Salovey and Mayer took the view that emotional intelligence may or may not be related to other types of intelligences, such as cognitive ability, and recently made the more specific prediction that emotional intelligence is related to, but at the same time is distinct from, other types of intelligences. Thus, we predicted that the 33-item measure of emotional intelligence would not be so highly related to cognitive ability as to be redundant. So what they're trying to show is, well, if this measure is measuring what it's supposed to measure, in other words, emotional intelligence, then it shouldn't be really related to other types of intelligence, because theory says that different types of intelligence are not necessarily correlated with each other. They, if you have high emotional intelligence, you may not have high levels of other types of intelligence. So what they did here is they tested this prediction by relating scores on the measure of emotional intelligence to scores on the SAT, combined math and verbal sections, which are widely used measures of cognitive ability related to college aptitude. And so here they described how they conducted this analysis, and they found that the scores on the 33-item measure of emotional intelligence were not related to SAT scores. And so the measure behaved the way it should have behaved. So there was no relationship between emotional intelligence and cognitive intelligence, which is great because that's what the theory would have predicted. And so here again, this finding confirms that there is discriminant validity of the measure of intelligence, of emotional intelligence. And then you have another study that they also did once again to confirm that indeed this measure has high discriminant validity. And this time they tried to look at the relationship between emotional intelligence and other traits like neuroticism, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness to experience. And so they said that to be useful, scores on the new measure, that is emotional intelligence measure, should not correlate so highly with a dimension of the Big Five as to be redundant. And once again, we have findings from that study right here, and they confirm that indeed higher scores on the measure of emotional intelligence were significantly associated with greater openness to experience and not significantly related to any of the other Big Five dimensions. And so this data shows that emotional intelligence measure that they were using has high discriminant validity because it shows that it is a different concept, it measures a different concept as it should be than those other constructs that have been defined in previous research. So you can see that quite a lot of work has to be done in order to, what we say, validate a measure seriously. You should test its relationship to a number of different other concepts to see whether, and then there is reliability, which again means the extent to which a measure is consistent over a similar period of time or similar circumstances. And in
questionnaire measures whenever we write items. You may remember, if you already listened to the videos about survey design and questionnaire design, the reliability of questionnaire measures improves when we have multiple items, so more than one question or item to measure a concept, when the items are written clearly and when people get clear instructions. Because if you don't give people clear instructions, they may not understand what you want them to say, and they may not tell you what you want. So then your measurement becomes messy. You're not getting consistent answers that you should get over similar people or similar situations. And so your questionnaire measure becomes like that scale that gives a different weight every time the same person steps on it. I'm going to just present to you a couple of ways in which reliability is oftentimes assessed. There's more than these, but these are just the two that you have to be familiar with. One is what we call the test-retest method. It involves simply administering the same measure twice to the same group of people. So for instance, on a Monday, you could administer the measure of self-esteem and then come back to the same people on a Tuesday and again administer the same measure of self-esteem. And over such a period of time that's so short, the responses that people should give to both should be similar or should be consistent. There is an example of this approach also in our example article that we are looking at. So let's go to that, to page 173. So here, the authors wanted to test the reliability of the emotional intelligence measure, and in order to do so, they asked 22 female and 6 male college students from the southeastern United States to complete the scale. They completed the measure twice with a 2-week interval between measurements, and then the two sets of responses were compared to each other for each person. And the test-retest reliability method involves calculating a correlation between responses. And so in this case, the correlation was 0.78, which is pretty high. This is acceptable level of reliability, test-retest reliability. You really don't have to know how to calculate it at this point. You just need to understand the idea. This is how researchers may assess reliability of a measure. So once again, test-retest method involves collecting responses on the same measure twice from the same group of people and then comparing the responses for each person. And if there's a high correlation between the two, we have high test-retest reliability. The by far most popular method of testing reliability of measures which consist of multiple items, like this measure of self-esteem, is what we call the internal consistency method. Another name for it is the Cronbach alpha, from the name of the researcher that first developed this measure. And another name for it, which is not as common, is item to total method. But that last name, item to total method, kind of really illustrates what you do, or what a computer does, because now it's calculated using a computer program when this reliability is evaluated. So watch. It simply involves calculating a correlation between the entire measure, so all of the items, and in turn, every single one of the items in a scale. So as you can see, what is happening here is we're comparing the responses to the entire scale, to the responses, or to the entire measure, to the responses to individual parts of that measure. And the end product of that comparison, again, it's done via a computer program, is a coefficient that ranges from 0 to 1, and the lowest acceptable level of that is 0.70. So whenever someone reports that the reliability of their measure using Cronbach alpha coefficient was 0.7 or higher, then it's an acceptable level. It's a standard that is accepted in the research community. So what you should know basically is how it's calculated in general terms and what is the acceptable level of this coefficient. So let's look at an example also from the article that we're looking at here for illustration. And here the authors report that an internal consistency analysis showed a Cronbach's alpha of 0.90 for the 33 item scale. That's very high and that's very good if you have a reliability coefficient of 0.9. So this is the other way of calculating reliability of a measure, a questionnaire measure. And finally, I just want to remind you that we also have the concept of intercoder reliability, which we discussed when we talked about content analysis.